Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Joe Devine, and I'm the Executive Director of the Tech Collective. I want to welcome you to today's presentation. We're trying to do Cyber Tuesday presentations at least once every Tuesday. This is actually our second today. Appreciate you guys all joining us. The Tech Collective, like everybody else, is kind of adjusted to COVID pandemic situation. All of our content now, all of our programming is online through these virtual sessions. We thank you for coming today and listening to this, and we're sure you're going to get a lot out of this. We're happy to have Cisco presenting today, and I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. But I also want to let you know that we have, this is being brought to you by Vertical 6 and Ocean, two Tech Collective members that have both really leaned in during this pandemic and helped out with giving us good ideas for these content programs, as well as helping us behind the scenes in our steering committees and the kind of work that we're doing to make sure that we continue to provide high quality content for you. Today from Vertical 6, Rick Norberg and Dave Marble from Ocean are joining us. They're going to be helping with the presentation and kind of providing local, kind of like a local lens, and they'll be monitoring your questions. So it's a housekeeping issue. If you have any questions, just type them into the chat box, and either Dave or Rick will pop those questions out at the right time to our guest presenter. Today's conversation is around business continuity and enabling your remote workforce team. Obviously, almost everybody's done that in the last 3 or 4 months, and as reopening plans coming clearer into focus, we're hearing from many companies that they will probably not go past 50% in the office. A lot of people are going to continue to work from home for the foreseeable future, probably for the long term, if not, for a real long time. So, thinking about how do we really make sure that our workforce is enabled to work from home, and thinking about how business continuity, plays into that is the focus of today's presentation. We're very happy to have Matt White with us today. Matt comes to us from Cisco, and tell you a little bit about Matt. Matt is a systems engineer in the cloud networking business unit at Cisco. He has a long history of successfully designing and implementing SDWAN, MPLS, wireless mobility, data center, and collaboration solutions, and has supported both U.S. public sector as well as global enterprise customers. He brings over 20 years of experience with interoperability of cloud, network, computing, and application environments. Matt's a 7-time CCIE and holds the Cisco CCDE and VMware VXIX-NV certifications. Matt, welcome to the Tech Collective. Really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Anytime I can get an opportunity to talk about my favorite things, it's always exciting. So look forward to hosting this over the next hour or so.
Happy to.
So really, when we talk about business continuity solutions, one of the things that's probably top of mind right now is obviously the fact that for many people, the world broke several years ago, and folks were scrambling to determine, what next steps to take. How do we get, people to work remotely? How do we collaborate remotely? And what I'm going to go through today is really more of an open forum. I always encourage, we have WebEx, we have the chat interface with WebEx. So I'm going to encourage folks to ask questions there, but I'm certainly not against taking yourself on mute and speaking up either. I don't mind that at all. This is usually a lot easier when I'm walking around a conference room or a boardroom. It's a little more interactive because I just can't see all of you at the same time in my presenter mode. So if there are any questions or comments or stories, or if you want to disagree, don't worry about hurting my feelings. That's the last thing. I left that 10 years ago or so. But one thing that I have seen over the last couple of decades is IT as an organization. We're getting better, but traditionally has been very reactive. And I don't think this latest scenario, this pandemic has been all that different. We obviously didn't expect for this to happen. I don't think organizations and businesses were expecting it to happen. And we have the opportunity to prove we can do a lot of this stuff, but the next time it happens, I'd really love for this to be prepared a little better. And that's not any existing vendor or any organization. It's just the nature of how we do business. We're not used to doing things differently, especially in a quick fashion. So this is kind of my warning message. Eventually things will be back to normal, and folks will forget what this is like. It's important that we take the lessons we've learned and then look forward, so we don't have to be so reactive. And I don't think I'll find too many people who will disagree with that statement. Any questions before we get started? I always like to ask, what folks are expecting. If there's anything that I can focus on, this is your time. It's not mine. I'm simply assisting and hoping to provide some valuable storytelling, some knowledge transfer. But if there is anything that is more top of mind than others, I'm happy to entertain those as I kind of go through and speak through this. Wait for folks to respond if they choose to. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead and get started. And like I said, don't hesitate to interrupt me at all. These are three things that are fundamental to network or application or any type of design you can imagine, but they are often forgotten during remote work scenarios. And there's a reason that secure is on top. I don't specialize in security. I'm more of a generalist within my business unit, but I do see that previously when corners were cut, a lot of times they were cut in security. Again, lessons learned, that doesn't happen so much anymore, especially with folks doing foolish things like the malware and BitLocker and locking up all of the municipalities' data and demanding that they pay a ransom. Unfortunately, some places have to do that. So there has been more awareness. That's good for everyone else involved because it shows that it can happen to you. The other thing is it needs to be repeatable. Long gone are the days where you have all of your employees within your walls. And there's a big difference between working remotely with an iPhone and mobile mail outside of the office at lunchtime, before and after business offices, and actually spending an entire day doing what you're supposed to be doing. There's a human element that's lacking, and to be able to do this remotely, we need collaboration technologies that scale. We also need secure network infrastructure that scales. And then the third thing is, just because there's a pandemic or some type of event that causes this to happen, either right now or in the future, not so foreseeable future, we really want this to be manageable in a sense where you can't go and reset and hire your entire IT staff because people are working from home now. You need it to be a solution. You need it to be an operation that your IT folks are comfortable with and can understand and scale out and manage and do everything from reset passwords to even potentially re-provision applications, or make sure that they can make sure the security aspect of it actually makes sense. Because without that content, you might as well not have any security at all. You need to know what's going on, and it needs to be a manageable solution. Now I'm not going to spend much time on any specific vendor or any specific technology today. These are really best practices that should transcend no matter what type of hardware or software or remote connectivity you're deploying. These should resonate regardless of any of those moving pieces. Now, if anyone wants to ask me about a specific implementation or best practices for a specific device, I'm happy to answer those to the best of my ability. Obviously, I know Cisco very well. Other vendors I can take a stab at. I've worked with a lot of them, but there's it's not something that I work with exactly every day, but these concepts are all going to be the same. Do we have any questions, any clarification? Anyone want to provide direction or questions around direction?
Hey, Matt. Thought I'd add to your to your problem. So when this happened, when COVID really struck in the April timeframe, we found that a lot of our clients were prepared, but they were partially prepared, right? We had a subset of their workforce that normally worked remotely, but they were not equipped, to do this on a grand scale. So that was like the first order of business, and now, it appears, or doesn't appear, it actually is, right, that we've entered a new paradigm where as we go forward in this new world, this ability to work from anywhere, anytime, has really changed the construct of how we do business and the way that we have our people, staffed and maintained. So I guess from going with this is there was this mad rush in the March, April timeframe to enable those who weren't enabled to take the 30% of workers that were home office workers and now go to 100%. But now there is the evolution of the technology, right? Because some of this tech existed before, but it just really wasn't widespread. So I guess as part of this, I'd love to know your thoughts on, how, the old model was you just had someone work from home, they VPN'd in, maybe they had something sophisticated as a split tunnel. Now we're moving to issuing firewalls to people that, basically make their home a secure connection back to the office or to the cloud, really, not even back to the office anymore. So as part of the presentation, I'd love to get some of your thoughts on that as you go through it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, security is different. And like you said, the existing solutions we found a lot of the times didn't scale because folks didn't account for it. People didn't plan for 100% remote worker connectivity. So what you would have is a situation where most of the time people would have a VPN client on their laptop or their remote desktop if they were issued one from home. Sometimes you might have a remote phone or video telepresence device, less frequently. And what ends up happening with that model is the user logs into the laptop, enters their authentication, credentials, they get validated, and now there's a tunnel nailed up between the laptop, the remote endpoint, and the VPN concentrator device that exists either at the client's business location or in a data center somewhere. And that model worked well sporadically. Again, we weren't asking 100% of the workforce to come in and spend all day nailed up to a VPN concentrator. And what we found is the bandwidth, especially if it was asymmetrical, especially if you had different uplink and downlink speeds, which you almost always do at a user's home. And sometimes you even have that kind of provisioning at a data center, again, less frequently, that the capacity of those links would become oversubscribed. And this isn't like the old days with PBXs where we had a number of T1s that would fill up a T3 or a number of dedicated slots. I mean, those old models, if you had 21 people connect and that was what you had capacity for, the 22nd simply couldn't connect. And you can do some of those things in VPN client provisioning, but most people didn't think it through. They were licensed for 1,000 users and never really thought of it because they didn't see anywhere near that capacity. What happens is let's say you have capacity for 21. Well, the 22nd, the 23rd, and the 24th each removed from the user experience. Now everyone connecting in is having a bad experience as opposed to a hard count of those client VPNs. So that's one of the first things that we saw was just running out of internet bandwidth for the remote workers. So a couple of things that we would recommend there, and definitely we're going to spend some time on security here, but just around that design model, we found in many cases companies had adopted a cloud-first initiative, and it's varying degrees of commitment there. Some folks were still talking about it, others were all in on things like AWS or Azure or Google Cloud. And we saw this a lot with schools because the majority of the schools, the K through 12 environments, were all using Google Classroom. Well, there's absolutely no need for a student bringing a Chromebook home, getting on their internet connection, and they don't need to get back to the school. It doesn't make any sense. There's nothing there because the same data that they're accessing in the school is the same data that they would access from home. So Obviously, not everyone has a K through 12 business model, but we found that the companies that had moved more information to cloud storage or repositories had less of an issue. Now, that opens up another can of worms, because there were a handful of those organizations that were under the impression that if you are all in on cloud, they kind of take security, take care of the security for you. You don't need to worry about firewalls and antivirus and malware and all these other fun things. We're in the cloud. We're 100% safe, and that's something I cannot disagree with, more. I mean, that is definitely not the case. And if either you or your lawyers read the very long terms and conditions, that is spelled out no fewer than 20 or 30 times throughout the terms and conditions. It's your data. We're just providing the hosting for it and the connectivity, but it's still your responsibility to secure it. So that was interesting. Another type of business environment was like a call center or 911 environments for a few states that we helped out. You need a phone, and it really doesn't work to have a soft phone on a laptop when you're dealing with things like call recording software and call routing. You really do need an endpoint, especially with folks who are comfortable with that. And in that case, we would deploy a hardware VPN device for a distributed SDWAN environment, a multi-site-to-site VPN. And with some of our solutions, we're really able to secure those quite well, and also do the split tunneling on the endpoint device. It makes no sense for all of your users to come back into the data center just to go out to the internet. And there are a handful of different models there. You can come in. You can have ports on a hardware device dedicated for home traffic. We're not inspecting that traffic. We don't want to know where people are going on their home network environment. That's why, it's kind of spelled out here. There's some things you don't want to know about. We also make use of some of our provisioning technologies, our security technologies that don't require any type of VPN and are really deployed in a cloud model. What I'm specifically talking about here, just as an example, because I can't think of any others, is the Cisco Umbrella product that does all of your content filtering. It does a tremendous amount of malware detection, even all the way down to the adware, and it does not require a local connection to your network or data center or even extension through VPN. And that can be deployed very easily. That's one of the biggest benefits to a platform like that, is you can deploy it in seconds and really repeat that policy for all your users. So you want to be very mindful of that. The other issue is mixing home and work environments. There's an interesting discussion that came up, more than I would expect for this question to be asked. And the question was really, will the company now pay for my internet now that I have to work from home? And in some cases, the answer was, well, okay, but the majority of the time, no. The company would not pay for the internet. You have internet anyway, and we're enabling you to work from home. Other things were like, well, we don't have to heat the office anymore, or we don't have to provide meals for, workers in Silicon Valley. Can we expense our lunches? And I always laughed at that. So finances are never easy. Fortunately, that's not my expertise. The other thing is you need to make this simple. You need to make security simple so that it does not restrict the end user. And again, cloud-based products like Umbrella, their malware detection, things that you can control from a central point that you're comfortable controlling, and that extending that workforce doesn't really doesn't cause any issues in terms of connectivity or security. You want familiar policy. You don't want to deploy something new when all of a sudden you need to move, 100% of your workforce to remote. So that's probably one of the most significant things, is the experience. Again, users understand there's turmoil and there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve. Hopefully that won't happen to that extent again if this occurs. But when it comes to security, you really don't get a lot of second chances. So you really need to be familiar with that architecture prior to deploying. And I can't if I could just say that over and over again for the next, half hour, I would. And then two-factor authentication. I think that's pretty standard in our industry right now. I hope it is, because the days of just using a username and password to get into an environment, I think are long gone. There's, if you are not using two-factor authentication right now, I've never resorted to scare tactics. That's not what I'm doing now. This is not a sales-focused presentation, but I feel badly if you are not using some type of Google Authenticator, Microsoft, two-factor authentication, their authenticator, Duo is out there. There are plenty that are fairly low cost or free. You get the support that I guess you put into it. And some of those solutions do more than others, but if you're just using a username and password now, there will be issues. So having that extend remotely should be seamless. That should already be in place, and that should scale regardless of the geography of your remote workforce and what they're doing. Any thoughts or questions about security? And are there any issues folks have run into? Probably, I don't know if it's a good forum to
One
say.
of the ones, Matt, this is Dave. One of the ones that has been an interest in, and we are involved obviously in the K-12 space and the university space and education in general, is, I wish there was just a more generic term than business continuity, because obviously a big part of this is education continuity and healthcare continuity and things that aren't necessarily quote business. But as an example, the content filtering piece of the puzzle has been a very interesting discussion, because as a student goes home with a Chromebook that may be supplied by a school or not, there are questions about child protection, which under the acronym CIPA, the child protection laws that exist in the school are part of, quite honestly, their technology funding arm or their E-rate arm, and whether or not that applies or not, when that child is now learning from the home and how that works. So that is something that I will say, in fact, we were actually having this discussion this morning, that has not been settled from even a district by district or school by school basis, as to whether or not they want to maintain that CIPA compliance and use the content filtering policies that are applied to the school itself, or they want to leave that in the hands of the parent, who is getting that internet access from home, and say whether or not, they need to, because you get into whether or not you're actually now supporting this remote user, this student, and whether or not you want them to be compliant with the CIPA architecture that exists in the school. I'm just saying it's become, it's a very interesting subject, and one that, depending on your decision from a school perspective, may or may not involve a very technical implementation to allow that to all work.
Right. No, agreed 100%. And I've spent so much time on that very topic the last couple of months, especially when school was still in. Some of the reactive mechanisms that a lot of the municipalities have taken are, now's a great time to implement municipal-wide Wi-Fi. And that's actually, there's probably about a dozen across New England right now that we're well past the planning phase. I want to make sure that as fall begins, and being mindful about the fact that, especially in a lot of the larger cities with increased population, you're also going to have more families that are without internet access. And how do you go about ensuring that they receive comparable education to the folks who have redundant internet connections at home? I mean, that can't be a place that you just kind of stop and say, oh well. So that's actually the easy part. We can figure that out. We can do municipal Wi-Fi. in some environments, we've had an LTE gateway that is managed by the same solution that you manage wireless and switching and everything else. So again, it kind of comes into a full stack management suite. But what we want from a content perspective, a filtering perspective, is for that policy to follow the user. And in the case of a student, there are a handful of ways you can do that. If you are using a technology that doesn't require a nailed up VPN, or if let me start with a remote appliance solution. If we're sending a small and expensive device with a SIM card in it, some of the more rural areas that just can't even get internet to begin with, we've gone with an LTE solution because some of these districts and states, for that matter, have contracts with the big telco providers, so they can get unlimited data and get some pretty good costs. And it's also goodwill, I think, from the carriers during this time. And that box, you plug it in, and usually it's a school-issued Chromebook in that kind of environment. And the same SSID, the same wireless network that Chromebook connects to within the walls of the school is the same SSID that's broadcasted in the home. And we simply tunnel that information back either to a central point or just set it up so that you can authenticate locally. So the Chromebook is really the only thing that can even get on the network. And once they're on the network, we've taken that policy and replicated it very easily. It's some of the solutions, it's literally copying and pasting like an API key. And then you can just select a drop-down list for 300 different remote appliances. And that same school policy that has already been built and ratified at the beginning of the school year, you can now push out to all your students behind cellular gateways or hardware devices that have embedded wireless and use existing internet connectivity. Or in the case of a Chromebook, if you're using a cloud-based solution, you can push out policy using Google Schools or Google Enterprise, depending on that version of Google and how you're managing your Chromebooks. So there's always a way around those limitations. It just takes time like these for us to really figure them out and be creative. And some really neat workarounds there to get kids online and also not going to bad sites. I'll tell you, for one, my home environment is basically a lab as well, and definitely overkill when it comes to content filtering and security and certificates and everything else. But I will tell you, when I implement a change, I go and tell my 7-year-old and my 11-year-old, go and see if you can get to something you're not supposed to. And I challenge them, and I use the methodology of the ethical hacker or the bug bounty program, where I'll actually reward them if they are able to find a way, if they're able to circumvent restricted YouTube mode, or if they're able to go to inappropriate sites or do things. It's certainly not my only validation for a lot of these things, but kids are resourceful and they can figure out ways around things, and always keep us on our toes. Big part of it.
It's just as an aside, it's pretty funny in this whole thing. I went out and bought a Chromebook for my son to use in school this last 3 months, and I used his account from his school Google Classroom to set up the Chromebook, and it locked me out as the administrator, and it applied a whole bunch of policies that they had set up, and I was like, wow, that's interesting. Like I could see, like, if you had a school issued Chromebook and you just wanted to set up that Chromebook for that user and log in as them, it would apply that policy, but it applied it as the admin as soon as I logged in, which was pretty interesting. I hadn't experienced that before. So I immediately reset it and used my account and let him be the guest. But point is that, it was interesting that they had all that set up, to Dave's point, to try to have some level of content filtering. His email address was restricted, his Gmail address was restricted, and a lot of the things on the actual machine itself under his profile were restricted. So, and that was put together in a very short period of time. So,
yeah, and that's definitely a way to do it. With Chromebooks, it's interesting because you within the Google portal, whether it's schools or enterprise, if you're using your enterprise management applications, you have two ways to do it. You can restrict the browser, which is the Chrome browser and the operating system, and then you also have the ability to restrict the actual device. So my school district, I did the same exact thing you did. Although I wanted a Chromebook to play with and don't use it a lot, so my son uses it, and when he's logged into his school account, basically everything is locked down, but they don't assume ownership of the device either, so they do it a little bit differently, so it's not quite as restrictive. And then when he logs in with his personal account, the only restrictions in place are what is on the Wi-Fi. So pretty cool. I mean, I do like that model because it doesn't really add any overhead to your environment, but you still need to get wireless out to, in some cases, 20% of the school population. So that's where a lot of our focus has been, getting that Wi-Fi connectivity. We've also done some creative things with even like putting a cellular gateway on a school bus and a couple APs hanging off the side of it and putting that in a parking lot. It's allowed for students to come and hopefully maintain social distancing and get on the internet. And again, it's the same SSID that they're used to seeing at the schools. So we can learn a lot from those K through 12s and higher eds, that's for sure, in the traditional enterprise environment. So anything else before we kind of move on here to manageability? Always been on the fence as if that's even a real word or not, but I put manageable at the top.
I will say too that they do a good job of implementing the zero trust model. We're moving a lot of people, a lot of clients to that model. And, with students, there's no other alternative, right? Like you start there and then start cranking it back because they'll hack it. They'll use it to do things they shouldn't do. Like that's just the ultimate, test of that model. So
Yes,
I thought
they do a nice job of that. One of the other things I didn't mention, but you reminded me of it, is most web traffic now is encrypted. And how do you manage that in an environment? Well, if it's a closed environment like a school, you can do some pretty cool things. And again, just using an open DNS or Umbrella solution, just because I'm familiar with it, but I'm sure there are others out there. You can actually use your mobile device management, something like a product to manage all the Chromebooks. So they could be Macs or iPads or Androids. It really doesn't matter. And you can push out a trusted root certificate to all these machines. At that point, you basically have I don't want to call it a glorified proxy, but it almost kind of works that way. But for a few years now, folks have struggled with getting a box big enough to be able to handle SSL decryption as people are going and using SSL on the public internet, because as time goes on, more and more of those sites are going to be encrypted. So you have very little recourse to look inside the traffic to determine if there's anything malicious or if there's content that may not be appropriate outside of just name resolution of the website. So using tools like Umbrella from a cloud-based model rather than relying on a box, it got to the point where very quickly you couldn't build a firewall powerful enough to decrypt all of these sessions for SSL. So using something where you don't have to take care of that box and it's just going to scale out horizontally as load increases, that's the way to do it. You also don't have to worry about going home and then tunneling back to that firewall in a headquarters or data center. As long as you're on the internet, you're going to have that filtering in that policy, even for SSL, for encrypted traffic. So, anything, and folks on the panel here, any discussions, anything they've seen that's worked well or not from security as we go into the management aspect of best practices? All right. So from a manageability standpoint, we talked a little bit about scaling the security model. And if you don't have a way to understand and aggregate all your security considerations, whether it's one building or whether it's 1,000 and another 1,000 remote home users. If you don't have a way to view that, you're wasting your money buying security. And I'd like to stand up here and say, yes, go and buy all the antivirus and malware protection and cloud-based threat monitoring and everything. But if you're not understanding what those solutions are telling you, in some cases it's actually worse than not having any security at all. So you really want to be able to have a platform to manage all the security solutions aligned to all of the locations, regardless of where they are. And again, that kind of makes its way up to the top again, because that is so important, because that can be a deal breaker very, very quickly in terms of, especially if we're talking about kids. That plays into visibility as well. You want to be able to see all of your endpoints, whether those are client connections. You need to be able to manage very quickly and understand if your client VPN connections are oversubscribed. If you only have a pipe with room enough for 200 client VPN connections or 100 site-to-site VPN connections over an SD-WAN, you need to be able to understand what that threshold is. And as you approach, that maximum throughput, you need to be able to react to that. There's no way to react to it. It's for the words reactive. If something bad happens, then you need to fix it, but by that time you're already getting phone calls and it's too late. It's much easier to understand trends, what applications are doing things, what applications are not doing well, and also whose fault is it. And that's key, because in environments, again, using the model where we're using an ISP that is a residential grade ISP at someone's home, and they're using either a tunnel back to a data center, a tunnel directly to a cloud, or some other type of connection to an application. Something's slow. How in the world do you tell what to troubleshoot? And the problem is, you need to be able to determine, is it the local network? Is it the WAN connection? Is it the ISP? Or in the case of environments like Office 365 or ServiceNow or some other type of application hosted provider, is it their problem? Again, using my home lab as an example, I'm always seeing issues with Xbox Live, especially kids are playing Xbox and not doing their remote learning like they're supposed to. But 9 times out of 10, it would be slow. I hear complaining of latency, which was not of significant concern to me. But you go and look at the management, and you'd see that, yeah, it's actually Microsoft that's having the issue with the Xbox Live service, probably because all those kids are home playing Fortnite or whatever it is. You can use that model for really anything, and most folks are using it for Office 365 to determine, is it the ISP? Is it the provider? Is it the application? And that helps with planning and provisioning capacity for any of these environments. So that to me is a given as well. That's something that I feel like a lot of folks don't necessarily invest in because it can be complicated and because it can be expensive. Certainly talk to the folks here on the panel about mitigating both of those issues. Last thing is, next to us is firmware. How do you manage all these devices while they're out there? Either software VPN clients, either agents that are installed on workstations or apps that are installed on iPads or Android devices or Chromebooks. There are security fixes on a lot of these hardware devices as well. If you deploy 1,000 of these things, how easy is it to upgrade and manage the core operating processes on those devices? And if the answer is, well, you have to SSH into each one of them, or you have to set up a TFTP server, or you have to, put something in place to make that work, that's the wrong solution. You want to be able to easily manage and upgrade everything under your control while you have the opportunity to do so and not have to go and hire 5 additional people to do it. Again, overlooked. It's not the coolest thing to talk about. You know, it's not exciting. Firmware, no one has ever get excited. Well, I get excited when new firmware comes out, but most normal people don't. And then the performance management. Kind of what I talked about with the visibility, and those two tie into each other, but understanding the performance and have you oversubscribed your environment. Talked about how a lot of places did because they never planned for, say, 1,000 remote workers when they were setting up an environment that could only handle, you know, 50 or 100. So understanding the performance and what the bottleneck is key, and moving forward and having a stable work environment.
Well, you know, just one thing that strikes me about, you know, manageable, you know, when we think about those 4 line items or whatever, one of them that's interesting is if you can make the technical discussion about security and visibility and, you know, and the processes that you need and the performances, and then you can think about the people aspect of management of this remote environment. And I know, for example, you know, if you've got a Chromebook sitting out there and, you know, and you know, say the case of Providence school system, and, you know, and all of a sudden they, you know, the parent has to do something in order to affect a change on the Chromebooks and all of the, you're going to get a wildly variable result. You also have the issue of if something doesn't perform and or operate and act in the most simplistic and easy and consistent way, then you lose your audience very quickly. And so, and I can say, and Rick can say, you know, from a CEO perspective, and I know a couple of my people are on this call, so, you know, take it for what it's worth. It's not as easy, you know, for me to understand the productivity of my employees and what they're doing on a, you know, in this remote environment. And so some of the tools and visibility and applications that allow us to collaborate and the ease of use of those at the application level become more and more important as we go along. And I want to reiterate something that I think Rick said earlier, is that, you know, the first couple of months of the COVID thing, you know, we were shoring up VPN pools and doing the kinds of things that would shore up a current environment. The last couple of months and going through this summer, we're working on things that will become systemic, that will be an architecture more for the long term and or future. And so some of the things that we're doing now are different, you know, from an architectural perspective. And again, they have a much longer term. And you know, you had that slide was, you know, some of us will go back to the way it was and forget, you know, what we just went through. I'm not so sure, you know, that we're going to forget this one, you know, to a certain extent. And even if I just took the school-based thing, is it doesn't look like we're going to have any more snow days, you know, in Rhode Island. Yeah, so it's like, so we got that going for us, which is nice. But you know, but that'll become, because people are now more conducive to using the remote technologies than they were 2 months ago. And so having a snow day where everybody uses this is certainly you know, appropriate. But there are still architecture and systemic systems that need to be put in place to broaden the access for people. And so I'm on calls every 5 minutes for, you know, some new initiative to try to get broader and better access to homes and architectures for that. We're building Wi-Fi parking lots, and, you know, Matt, you talked about some of that kind of stuff, municipal broadband and the municipal Wi-Fi's and community Wi-Fi environments. Those are the discussions that are happening right now. So, yeah, so I just wanted to throw in that there's a correlation between the technical side of this and just that flat out people aspect. And we all know that the people are the most vulnerable part of any security architecture in the first place, as an example, right?
Without a doubt.
Really well said, Dave. And I would say too that we talked about this on our pre-call, but you know, these things, pandemics, big events like this tend to accelerate trends that are already underway. So when this hit, you know, we were already moving to a much more distributed world that had individual layer of security, you know, kind of like going to the mainframe model, then going back to the PC model, right? Where now you're getting even more highly distributed, but as a result of that, you need more security, better reliability, more ease of use, better tools, better applications. And, you know, this is in a lot of ways accelerated that trend, but it's also modified it at the same time, because I think, you know, we were kind of going down this old school VPN remote access path, and now we're evolving much quickly into this super cloud based, you know, more portable, more secure, more ease of use model. And certainly the tools people had, you know, the little things, right? Like if you had a 5-year-old laptop going into this, you know, we've seen a lot of our clients, you know, do refreshes much faster than they would have otherwise, because now it becomes a lot more apparent that that tool is no longer just a staple on their desk. It's how they're surviving right now. So we've definitely seen people invest heavily in technology that needed to. And the technologies that we're putting on their roadmaps, they're being a lot more aggressive in general. So that's an excellent from this.
Well, it's a great point, Rick. And you know, I challenged everybody if I had, you know, throwing a thing in the comments that basically said, okay, who had pandemic on their business continuity plan prior to March. And that was me being sarcastic a little bit, but the idea though of what you just stated, a lot of people moving more towards cloud environments and doing all this kind of stuff. Well, I really challenge the audience and the general let's say IT executives that are out there as to how far along you really are in your scenario planning as you move to cloud and what it really looks like from a topology perspective. I know, for example, one of the things that we were priding ourselves on is working with our members on things like replication and having a sort of always on environment between their compute environments in a DR scenario. So, you know, we eliminated the days of driving a truck, you know, to update, you know, your remote systems in some, like say IBM Sterling Forest or something like that, where you had a resiliency site. And, you know, we went from the truck to an online system that now has replication where you could even practice, you know, and we're always talking about practice and doing these kinds of things in DR and business continuity environments. But I challenge people to say, well, do you know how to do that now as you move to the cloud? Because it's not just taking, you know, a single application or your application environment and throwing it in the cloud. Matt, you know, talked about, you know, careful, security is a concern. It's not taken care of. Well, I would submit that resiliency is also not taken care of just by saying you're in the cloud now, because there are different options for having multiple instances in different cities and different pathways to those instances that would be required if you were to lose, say, Ashburn, Virginia, where a number of, you know, the East, you know, resides. Well, you know, those kinds of places can be vulnerable, and we have seen them taken out in the past. So how does that work, and how do you practice it? So there are a lot of issues like that. You can't just say, I'm now moving my application over here and it's going to be taken care of because it's not on site anymore. So there are a lot of issues associated with this idea of scenario planning in DR and business continuity that need to be expanded given a distributed work from home and a cloud-based architecture that I would submit we haven't all thought through to the nth degree.
I would add to that too, Dave, that the scenario for cloud planning, I mean, this is one aspect of it, the whole COVID-19 issue with working from home, but there are a lot of other factors. Like if you think back 10 years ago, if your server was in your office, your number one disaster recovery planning scenario was, what if I lose a hard drive or my server gets flooded, I restore from tape, right? Now we're talking about continuity, because every second you're down is a quantifiable dollar ROI problem, not to mention the fact that malware and those sort of threats have compounded themselves exponentially. So now you have to more disaster recovery and continuity scenarios that aren't just like, I'll plug a hard drive into my server. It's you need distributed 3 copies of it that aren't attached. They're over different networks with different security permissions, you know, and how are you going to recover those? So a lot more thought has to go into what that means, to your point, right? So just moving to the cloud isn't just like, oh, I'm just going to move my application to the cloud. It's like, no, I'm moving my infrastructure to the cloud. I'm making my workforce distributed. I'm making my equipment more highly available. I'm planning for malware and, you know, spyware attacks. I'm doing all of these things at the same time and I'm trying to make my people more productive and launch my organization into a 3-year strategic vision. You know, all those things now come into play when you're doing that plan. I think we might have lost Matt.
Did we lose Matt? Yeah, Rick, you know, one of the things that we've learned, especially over the last, you know, in the migration of the cloud stuff, is people, you know, are sort of started doing it and then realized that there was actually a network in between, you know, and that there needed to be some real understanding of what the network implications and then the security implications, and then all of that had to do with migration to the cloud. And and I remember working on with one of our members, you know, one of our larger members, who went application by application to determine exactly how that application would behave in a cloud environment, because it not only affected the performance of that application, and some of them flat out wouldn't work in a cloud environment, and it affected obviously hugely a pricing scenario as to what the usage, you know, actually looked like for that application when it resided in the cloud. And obviously this comes into play, especially if you're talking about backup or archive scenarios versus on-demand and primary compute environments is big, right? So, yeah, there's a lot to this subject. I am a huge fan of this idea of actually scenario planning and practice. Right. And the security aspects are great. Like, how do you practice? You've got to practice this stuff. And that's why I don't think anybody was practicing pandemics, you know, in February, right? Which is why we, you know, a number of us had to sort of react.
Yeah, I do think it helped move a lot of the other stuff forward too, like the continuity plan you were talking about, like unplugging the server and see if the failover actually works. You know, as an IT provider, we do a lot of that, but you know, sometimes when we take on a client, we're like, have you ever tested this scenario? And they're like, well, we were told it was going to work. I'm like, that's
well, I have it all backed up. Oh, have you ever tried to actually have it work once you, oh no.
Yeah, the tape ejects every night. We're fine. I don't get it.
Again, the good news is that a lot of newer technologies like Zerto replication and even and the Microsoft SRM stuff and site recovery stuff, those are now embedding features that allow you to practice.
Right.
And that's important to understand that about your replication environments and how that all works, and whether or not you can practice while you're in production, right?
Right. And see if it is actually seamless.
Speaking of business continuity, I dropped there. We literally
saw that. Yeah, I saw that.
We lost power, and my DX80 is still booting up, but I was able to get
back. You're back on, so you can take over again.
Yeah, clearly there's a link I'm missing in my disaster recovery there, because I expected the DX80 to go offline. I did not expect internet access to, so we'll see what the issue was there. But again, you can't account for a lot of these things until they actually happen. I guess that's a good way to wrap this up. I think we're coming up on the top of the hour, and you know, you can test as much as you like. It's a lot easier to test than it was, you know, back in the day where you had to restore exchange from a number of tapes in a tape drive. No one ever did that. No one, you know, maybe 1 or 2 customers that I would work with would actually have an event every year where they tested the recovery of that. And half the time it worked, half the time it didn't, and you made adjustments. But it's a lot easier now.
Well, Matt, I really want to applaud your your idea to drop off intentionally at the end here, just to kind of demonstrate, you know, what could happen.
I'm not that good of a planner.
But I will say,
Go with
that,
it.
but Rick and I went into recovery mode, so you know we
Worked out great.
Without skipping a beat, it just continued. The two of those guys just kept it so smooth. It was silk.
That's the lesson learned, right?
We failed
You
over
do-
well. Virtual high five, Dave.
I think that
Good
was
failover. That's right, Rick. Great failover.
That's what they call active.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, guys, thank you so much, Matt. Really appreciate you taking the time today. I know we've had some questions. We have one more question for everybody in the chat. We do have a one question survey. If you have a moment, just let us know what you thought about today's presentation. We're trying to improve everything we provide, and appreciate your comments, feedback. You don't have to leave your information if you don't want to, but if you want to call back, we'd be happy to check in whether you felt strongly positive or negatively about it. All right. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. Vertical 6 for making this happen, bringing Cisco to us today. Rick and Dave from Ocean, thank you all for literally picking up the slack and picking up the failover. Thank you so much. Good all the way around. The group effort. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Dave. Joe. Thanks, Dave.
Have a great one.
Good to see you all.
My pleasure. Let us know if you have any questions.
Bye-bye.